Well, joining us from Sydney now is Markus Wagner. He's a Professor of Law and International Peace and Security at the University of Wollongong. Really good to have you with us, Professor. I guess the big question from an international law perspective is whether or not what the Trump administration has done in attacking Venezuela and capturing its leader is legal.
Thanks so much for having me. Look, Marco Rubio characterizes this as a law enforcement action, and for maybe domestic purposes from a U.S. law perspective, one can potentially make a claim to that. But it's fairly clear that from an international law perspective, the U.S. just violated the prohibition on the use of force, which is enshrined in the UN Charter and what we call customary international law. And that basically says that all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity. And what the U.S. has done is a military action against another member of the United Nations, captured the president, Nicolas Maduro, and brought him to U.S. territory. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. One is the action could be authorized by the United Nations Security Council, which didn't happen, or you can try to make to claim the right of self-defense. The problem here is that this claim would basically then constitute the drug trafficking that the government of Venezuela is alleged to have committed would have to be an armed attack against the United States. And at least in the history so far, drug trafficking just hasn't constituted an armed attack against the United States, against another country. And so I and most of my colleagues really can't see a reason for justification, and therefore the violation of Article 2.4 still remains. So that's the real problem that we're finding ourselves in.
We are expecting a meeting of the UN Security Council to take place in New York later on Monday. Apparently that meeting was called for by Colombia and is being backed by Russia and China. No doubt the issue of legality will be raised at this gathering, but what realistically could the UN Security Council do in response to this US operation?
Realistically, almost nothing. We might see a declaration by the remaining members of the Security Council, but the United States is one of the so-called permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which carry a veto with them. So any action or any resolution that might want to be passed, that other members might want to pass, would be vetoed by the United States.
And what about the issue of whether or not Venezuela's government was legitimate? Because we know we had both the Trump and Biden administrations declare Maduro's government illegitimate. We had the EU making a similar declaration. Does that go some way in justifying the Trump administration's operation?
Legally speaking, no. One might lament that. And from my own perspective, Nicolas Maduro was the head of a dictatorial regime. But legally speaking, no. Now, there's a political question that sometimes overrides, if you will, or goes alongside. And here, I think we're seeing ourselves in a very complicated situation. Your correspondents have already alluded to this, whether there's a popular uprising, with a whole range of different power centers in Venezuela now vying for the top spot. We've seen developments very likely due to U.S. pressure against the former vice president, now President Delcy Rodriguez. But all of this is going to become very complicated. And it doesn't look like the Venezuelan people will have what one would call the right of self-determination in a meaningful sense, but that rather the idea is to get access to the minerals in Venezuela, which seems to have been the plan all along. And now we're seeing this idea of running the country, and I put running in quotation marks because it doesn't seem to be clear what that actually means in the eyes of the Trump administration.
Okay, Professor, we will have to leave it there. Really good to get your thoughts on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.